How to stop worrying about things that aren't your responsibility. The Stoic mindset that frees you. The weight you never agreed to carry. You are tired, not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, not the kind that a weekend erases. You are tired in a way that lives deeper than the body, in the part of you that has been running calculations for months, maybe years, trying to manage outcomes that were never yours to manage, trying to hold together situations that were never yours to hold. And the worst part is that you cannot explain it properly, because from the outside your life may look functional. You show up, you perform, you answer the messages, meet the obligations, keep moving. But inside, there is a constant low-frequency noise, a hum of unfinished business, of scenarios being rehearsed at 2 a.m, in the middle of conversations that deserve your full attention and cannot get it. What you are carrying is not your life. It is the accumulated weight of every responsibility you absorbed that was never assigned to you. Other people's emotions, other people's decisions, outcomes that depend on variables you cannot touch. The judgment of people whose opinion was never yours to control. You picked all of it up. Not because you are weak, but because no one ever taught you where your responsibility ends and where the rest of the world begins. That line exists. The Stoics found it 2,000 years ago, and in the next 60 minutes you are going to find it too. This is not a video about positive thinking. It is not going to ask you to breathe deeply or visualize a better outcome. What it is going to do is far more demanding and far more permanent. It is going to hand you a philosophy forged in the hardest conditions human beings have ever faced: slavery, exile, plague, war, betrayal, and show you how to use it on the exact situation you are living right now. Marcus Aurelius ruled the most powerful empire in the known world and wrote, Alone at Night, about the discipline required to not be destroyed by it. Epictetus was born into slavery, had his leg broken by his master, lost everything a person can lose, and became the most free human being of his age. Seneca faced execution, exile, and the collapse of everything he built, and left behind letters so precise about the nature of suffering that they read like they were written for you, this week, in your specific situation. These were not comfortable men offering comfortable ideas. They were people pressure-tested by reality who came back with something that held. The weight you are feeling is real. The fatigue is genuine. The anxiety is not invented. But the source of it is not what you think. At some point, probably early, probably before you had the tools to resist it, you learned that your emotional safety was connected to outcomes you could not fully control. Maybe it was a childhood home where keeping the peace required you to monitor other people's moods. Maybe it was a relationship where love felt conditional on performance. Whatever the origin, the lesson was the same. The world outside you is your emotional jurisdiction. If something is wrong, it is your job to fix it. If someone is suffering, it is your job to carry part of that suffering as proof that you care. Epictetus addressed this directly in the Enchiridion, chapter 1. He made the distinction that became the foundation of all Stoic practice. Some things are within our power and some things are not. Within our power are our opinions, intentions, desires, and responses. Outside our power are our bodies, our reputations, and everything that does not originate from our own choice. The exhaustion you feel is the predictable result of a math problem that cannot be solved. You have been allocating finite internal resources to an infinite and uncontrollable set of external variables. The equation was never going to balance. The fatigue was built into the assignment from the beginning. The Stoic intervention is not motivational. It is not telling you to try harder or push through. It is telling you something almost shockingly simple. Stop accepting deliveries that are not addressed to you. That does not mean indifference. It means something far more precise. Learning to distinguish between what genuinely belongs to your inner life and what belongs to the world's jurisdiction. The weight you have been carrying is real, but most of it arrived without your conscious permission. You did not sign for it. You simply did not know at the moment it was handed to you that you were allowed to set it down. How the mind becomes its own warden. There is a moment, it happens in seconds, sometimes fractions of a second, between what occurs in the world and what you feel about it. Most people have never noticed that moment exists, and that gap, that almost invisible space between event and reaction, is where your entire emotional life is being decided without your participation. The Stoics had a name for the raw, unprocessed impression that reality delivers before reason has a chance to intervene. They called it fantasia. It is the immediate stamp of an event on consciousness, the mental image that forms before you have chosen anything, before you have applied a single moment of deliberate thought. The fantasia arrives the way a fist hits a surface, fast, forceful, and indifferent to your preferences. But here is what the Stoics understood with unusual precision, and what modern psychology has spent decades slowly rediscovering. The fantasia is not the problem. The problem is what the mind does in the silence that follows. In that gap, the mind does not wait. It constructs. It builds a story around the raw event with breathtaking speed and almost no regard for accuracy. It reaches into its inventory of past experiences, old fears, inherited assumptions, and assembles a narrative that feels, with absolute convincing force, like reality. But it is not reality. It is interpretation. And interpretation, unlike reality, is something you can change. Someone you respect does not respond to your message for 2 days. The event is neutral. A person has not yet replied. That is all that happened. But the mind does not receive neutral facts. Perhaps they are angry with you. Perhaps the relationship is deteriorating. Perhaps you are being deliberately ignored. Each thought arrives not as speculation but as felt reality, complete with the emotional charge of something already confirmed. None of it was confirmed. None of it may even be true. But by the time reason arrives, if it arrives at all, the emotional response has been running for hours, sometimes weeks. Marcus Aurelius returned to this throughout the Meditations because he understood that a man in his position could not afford to outsource his inner life to unexamined impressions. In Book 6, paragraph 13, he wrote that, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your own estimate of it. And you have the power to revoke that estimate at any moment. Revoke the estimate. That is not a passive instruction. That is a command to take back authorship of your own interpretation. But why does the machine exist at all? The mind builds these stories because, for most of human history, rapid threat assessment was more valuable than accurate threat assessment. A mind that immediately assumed the worst survived more often than one that paused to examine the evidence. Fear was functional. Anxiety was adaptive. You inherited a survival machine, and you are trying to live a meaningful life inside it." Epictetus addressed the mechanism directly in the Discourses, Book 2, Chapter 1. He spoke about the way human beings confuse the impression of a thing with the thing itself, the way the mind presents its own construction as objective fact, and the way most people, never having been taught otherwise, accept that construction without question. He called the failure to examine impressions the root of all human misery, not external events, not fate, not the behavior of other people, the unexamined story. The cell feels real because it is constructed from real materials, real memories, real fears, real past experiences that genuinely hurt. The person who was abandoned before sees abandonment in a delayed message. The person who was controlled before sees threat in a disagreement. The past is writing the present, and because it is doing so below the level of conscious awareness, the person inside that process experiences it not as interpretation, but as truth. The Stoic practice begins precisely here, with the radical, disciplined act of catching the story before it becomes conviction, of inserting reason into the gap, of asking, with genuine rigor, "Is this what actually happened, or is this what my mind constructed from what happened?" The circumstances were never the prison. The unexamined story was, and an unexamined story, once examined, is no longer a prison. It is a draft, and drafts can be rewritten. The cut that changes everything. There is a line. It runs through every situation you have ever faced, every relationship you have ever been part of, every outcome you have ever worried about. Most people have never seen it, not because it is hidden, but because no one ever pointed to it and said, This is where you end and everything else begins. This is the border of your jurisdiction. The Stoics called the principle that defines this line the dichotomy of control. Epictetus placed it at the very opening of the Enchiridion, right at the beginning, as though he understood that nothing else he was about to say would be comprehensible without it. Some things are in our control and others are not. In our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and whatever are our own actions. Not in our control are body, reputation, command, whatever are not our own actions. That is the cut. Everything that originates from your own will belongs to you. Everything that exists outside your will, the opinions others form, the decisions others make, the outcomes of events you contributed to but do not own, does not belong to you. It never did. The reason this sounds simple and proves to be one of the most difficult things a human being can practice is that the line is not always obvious in lived experience. Reality does not arrive pre-sorted into columns. It arrives as one tangled, emotionally loaded experience in which your choices and other people's choices and random circumstance are woven together so tightly that the mind, confronted with that tangle, does what seems reasonable. It treats the whole thing as its problem. This is the error that costs everything. Consider what actually happens when you treat an outcome as your responsibility that is beyond your control. You do not gain influence over that outcome. What you gain instead is a sustained state of low-grade emergency, the neurological signature of a threat you cannot address. Your nervous system does not distinguish between a bear in the room and a scenario being rehearsed in the imagination. Both produce the same hormonal response. Both consume the same reserves. And when the threat permanently lives outside your control, that response never resolves. It simply runs. Continuously. At the expense of everything else. Marcus Aurelius understood this from the inside. He was the most powerful man in the Roman world, and power, as he learned, does not grant control. It grants responsibility without corresponding authority over outcomes. Emperors can issue commands and watch them fail. They can love people and watch them die. The gap between intention and outcome is not smaller for powerful people. And Marcus filled his private notebooks with the ongoing work of drawing and redrawing the line, reminding himself again and again what was his and what was not. In Book 12, paragraph 23, he wrote a set of questions he used as a daily diagnostic. Is it in my power? If yes, act. If no, accept. Stripped of everything elaborate, this was his practice. Not as a slogan, but as a genuine moment-by-moment interrogation of where he was directing his will. Some things feel as though they sit directly on the line. Your health. You can make choices that influence it, but you cannot ultimately control it. A relationship. You can bring honesty and care, but you cannot control whether the other person chooses to stay. Your career. You can bring skill and consistency, but you cannot control the market or the decisions of people above you. These are not things to ignore. They are things in which your will has a role. The role of effort, of virtue, of showing up with everything you have. But the outcome itself belongs to a jurisdiction larger than yours. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of Stoic philosophy. The dichotomy of control is not a philosophy of passivity. It does not tell you to stop trying or stop caring. It tells you precisely the opposite. Bring everything you have to what is yours to bring, and stop hemorrhaging energy on what isn't. The person who confuses acceptance with surrender exhausts themselves in a different way than the person who confuses effort with control. One collapses inward and calls it wisdom. The other expands outward into every corner of circumstance and calls it responsibility. Neither is free. The Stoic position is the narrow, difficult, precise middle. Full engagement with what is yours, clean release of what is not. Drawing the line is not a one-time event. The line must be redrawn in every situation, sometimes in every moment. Because the fantasia does not stop arriving, the world does not reorganize itself around your philosophical clarity. What changes is not the world. What changes is the speed and precision with which you locate the line within each new situation. The seduction of false responsibility. There is a feeling that masquerades as virtue so convincingly that most people never question it. It arrives dressed in the clothes of love, of loyalty, of moral seriousness. It feels noble. It feels necessary. It feels like proof that you are a good person. And it is quietly, systematically destroying your capacity to live. The feeling is this: if I care enough about something, I am responsible for it. If you love someone who is suffering, then caring means absorbing their suffering. To maintain your own equilibrium while someone you love is in pain feels like a form of abandonment, and so the mind concludes, without ever putting it into words, that the measure of love is the degree to which you allow another person's reality to colonize your own. This is not love. It is fusion. And fusion, however warm it feels from the inside, does not help anyone. Epictetus drew a distinction that cuts directly through this confusion in the Discourses, Book 2, Chapter 5. He spoke about the difference between being affected by things and being enslaved by them. He did not argue that a Stoic should feel nothing. That caricature of the philosophy has done enormous damage to its reputation. He argued that there is a categorical difference between responding to reality with appropriate feeling and allowing reality to commandeer your judgment and your capacity to act usefully. Think about what actually happens when someone you love is making a destructive decision. You see the direction they are heading. You have said something, perhaps many things. The decision continues regardless. The version of care that the world taught you says keep carrying it, keep worrying, keep losing sleep, keep returning to the scenario in your mind as though your suffering were a form of solidarity. But ask the question that almost never gets asked. Does your suffering change their trajectory? Does the weight you are carrying at 2 a.m. reach them in any form that alters what they are going to do tomorrow? In almost every case, the answer is no. Your suffering is not solidarity. It is a private experience happening entirely inside you, consuming resources that belong to you, producing nothing that reaches the person you are suffering on behalf of. You are paying a tax that funds nothing. Seneca addressed this in his letters to Lucilius, letter 99, written to a friend who was inconsolable in grief and who believed the depth of his grief was the measure of his love. Seneca wrote with extraordinary directness, "There is a difference between grief that serves the person you have lost and grief that serves only your need to demonstrate that you lost something." He was asking his friend to examine it honestly, to determine whether what he was carrying was actually helping anyone, or whether it had become its own indulgence. The same question applies here. The worry, the absorbed responsibility, the 2 a.m. rehearsals, ask what they are actually for. Because if the honest answer is that they are producing nothing useful, then what you are calling love or responsibility is something else. It is a habit. It is a way of feeling in control of something you cannot control. Because worry, however useless in practice, creates the sensation of engagement. It feels like you are doing something. You are not. But it feels that way. Now here is the harder question. If false responsibility is not actually helping the people you are carrying it for, what is it actually doing? It is keeping you available to the pattern. The mind that has organized itself around absorbing external problems needs those problems the way any system needs input to remain operational. When the problems are not there, the system experiences not relief, but disorientation, an emptiness where the familiar weight used to be, and because that silence is uncomfortable, the mind goes looking for new weight to carry. This is what makes false responsibility seductive beyond the moral dimension. It is not just that it feels virtuous. It is that it feels necessary. The person who has built their sense of purpose around being the one who holds things together does not experience the carrying as a burden. They experience it as identity. The weight is not something they have. It is something they are. And the prospect of setting it down is not experienced as relief. It is experienced as erasure. Every person who has ever sat with Stoic philosophy seriously has arrived at the moment where understanding and behavior diverge, where the intellectual acceptance of the principle meets the emotional refusal to practice it, where the map is clear and the feet will not move. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a feature of the nervous system doing precisely what it was trained to do. And training, unlike nature, can be retrained. The discipline of doing nothing. There is a moment that arrives in almost every difficult situation. A moment when the pressure to act, to respond, to intervene, to fix something becomes nearly unbearable. The silence feels irresponsible. The stillness feels like cowardice. Every instinct trained by years of absorbed responsibility screams that inaction is abandonment. That moment is a test, and almost everyone fails it, not because they are weak, but because they have never been taught what it actually means to pass. Doing nothing, in the Stoic sense, is not the absence of action. It is the presence of discernment. It is the disciplined recognition that this situation does not require your intervention, and that intervening anyway would not help the situation. It would only help you feel less uncomfortable about not intervening. And those are two entirely different things. Seneca made this distinction in his letters, Letter 3, when he wrote about the difference between a friend and a flatterer. The flatterer acts in ways that make themselves feel virtuous. The friend acts in ways that actually serve. The question that cuts is simply this: who is this action for? Ask that honestly in the moments when you feel compelled to act on something that is not yours, when you are about to send the message that reopens a conversation that was finished, when you are about to offer unsolicited advice to a person who has not asked for your assessment of their choices, when you are about to insert yourself into a dynamic that is not yours to manage. Who is this for? If the honest answer is that it is for you, for your comfort, for your relief, for your need to feel useful, then the action is not service. It is self-regulation disguised as generosity. And self-regulation disguised as generosity consistently makes the situations it inserts itself into worse. The Stoic exercise that addresses this directly is one of the most demanding in the entire tradition, precisely because it produces no visible result. It requires you to sit with the discomfort of a situation unfolding outside your control and do nothing except observe your own response to that discomfort. Not suppress the response. Observe it. This is the practice Epictetus described in the Discourses, Book 2, Chapter 18, when he spoke about training against impressions. He used the image of a wrestler who does not wait for the actual contest to begin training. For the Stoic, the contest is any moment when the untrained mind would reach across the line and take responsibility for something that does not belong to it. The training is the deliberate, repeated practice of recognizing the impulse and letting it pass without acting on it. Let it pass. Two words that carry an entire practice inside them. Because the impulse does not disappear when you let it pass, it intensifies first. This is what surprises people who attempt this practice without preparation. The mind registers the restraint as danger. It escalates its signals. It produces new justifications, new urgencies, new framings that make intervention seem morally obligatory. In the language of modern psychology, it is an extinction burst, the system turning up its volume before it accepts that the old pattern is no longer being rewarded. The person who knows this is coming can do something different. They can name what is happening. I am feeling the impulse to intervene, and it is escalating because I am not acting on it. And they can let the naming substitute for the action. Long enough for the intensity to peak and begin to subside. And it will subside. Every time. Because the impulse is not infinite. It is a wave, and waves break. Epictetus described this capacity with the Greek word anosh, a deliberate pause inserted between stimulus and response. Not permanent suppression. A pause. A moment of choosing. A space in which the question can be asked, is this mine? The discipline of doing nothing is, paradoxically, one of the most active practices available to a human being. It requires continuous engagement of the will. It requires the courage, and it is courage, genuine courage, to tolerate the discomfort of watching something unfold that you could attempt to influence and choosing not to, because the attempt would be for you and not for the situation. This courage produces no visible result that others can recognize. It earns no gratitude because no one sees it happen. It is entirely internal, entirely unrewarded by the social currencies the world distributes to people who visibly do things, and it changes everything. Because the person who can practice it has reclaimed their will from the patterns that were running it. Seneca wrote in Letter 77 about the difference between a life that is long and a life that is full. A person who has surrendered their will to the management of everything outside the line lives a long life experienced as perpetual emergency. A person who has reclaimed their will lives whatever time they have in a state he called compositum, settled, integrated, complete in each moment rather than permanently deferred to a future resolution that never fully arrives. The path to compositum runs directly through the discipline of doing nothing. Amor Fati, the love of what is. There is a position available to a human being that is not resignation and not enthusiasm, and not the performance of positivity in the face of difficulty. It is the capacity to look at what is actually happening, not what you wished would happen, not what you feared would happen, and say, this is what exists. And what exists is what I have to work with. The Stoics called this orientation Amor Fati, love of fate, not tolerance of fate, not acceptance in the gritted teeth sense. Love. The active, willed, deliberate orientation toward what is, including what is difficult, what is painful, what is not what you would have chosen, as the necessary and irreplaceable material of your life. This requires immediate clarification. Loving fate does not mean believing that everything happens for a reason in the sentimental sense, that some benevolent intelligence arranged your suffering for your ultimate benefit. The Stoics were too honest for that narrative. What Amor Fati means precisely is this. Reality is the only material you will ever actually have. The life you are living right now, with its specific contents, its losses, its limitations, its circumstances you did not choose, is the only life in which your will can operate. The alternative life, the one in which the loss did not happen, the diagnosis did not come, the relationship did not end, that life is not available. It exists nowhere except in the mind's archive of what might have been, and the mind perpetually oriented toward that unavailable life is not living in reality. It is living in a story about reality. And stories about reality cannot be the location of genuine action. Marcus Aurelius returned to this with urgent frequency in the Meditations. He had more than enough material for grief. He buried children. He fought wars he did not start. He watched capable people become corrupt and the machinery of civilization grind forward with indifference. And against all of that, he wrote notes about the discipline of meeting what is with full presence rather than partial resistance. The practice of Amor Fati is not the practice of pretending the gap between what you wanted and what is does not exist. It is the practice of refusing to live inside it. Epictetus understood this from a different angle, the angle of someone who had been a slave, who had experienced physical suffering at the hands of a master, who had every external circumstance of his life arranged by forces entirely beyond his control. From that position, Epictetus did not develop a philosophy of optimism. He developed a philosophy of interior sovereignty. In the Discourses, Book 1, Chapter 1, he wrote about the one thing that cannot be taken, the faculty of choice, the proheresis, the will's capacity to orient itself toward what is with dignity, rather than against it with futile resistance. This is the paradox at the center of Amor Fati that trips most people when they first encounter it. How can you love what you would change? How can you accept what you are simultaneously working to improve? The confusion comes from conflating two different things: the facts as they currently are and the direction in which your effort is applied. Amor Fati asks you to be clear-eyed and unresisting about the first. It says nothing about the second. You can fully accept that a situation exists exactly as it does right now, while simultaneously applying everything you have to what comes next. In fact, the person who has genuinely accepted reality is more capable of effective action than the person still arguing with it. Because arguing with reality consumes the resources that effective action requires. The obstacle is not in your way. The obstacle is the way. Not as a comforting metaphor, but as a description of how transformation actually works. The situation you most want to escape is the situation that contains, if engaged honestly rather than resisted perpetually, everything your capacity requires to develop into what it needs to become. The Inner Citadel. There is something inside you that has never been successfully invaded. Not because it has never been attacked. It has been perhaps repeatedly, but because its nature is such that it can only be surrendered from the inside. It cannot be taken from without. The Stoics called it different things in different texts. Marcus Aurelius called it the commanding faculty, the hegemonikon. Epictetus called it the proheresis, the faculty of choice. The scholar Pierre Hadot gave it the name that has entered the modern philosophical vocabulary, the inner citadel, the fortress of the self, the place where your freedom actually lives, regardless of what the world is doing outside its walls. The concept requires precise understanding, because it is easy to mistake it for something it is not. The inner citadel is not your emotions. Emotions move, shift, arrive unbidden, and respond to circumstances in ways that are not always within your immediate control. The inner citadel is not your opinions in the casual sense of preferences or beliefs that change with evidence and experience. It is not your personality, which is shaped partly by forces outside your will. The inner citadel is your capacity to choose your response to whatever happens. It is the space mind, sometimes very narrow, sometimes requiring great effort to locate, between stimulus and response, between what the world does to you and what you do with what the world does to you. Marcus articulated this in the Meditations, Book 8, paragraph 48. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. This is not motivational rhetoric. It is a precise description of what happens inside the inner citadel when it is functioning correctly. The obstacle is received not as a wall, but as material, not as proof that the path is closed, but as information about which path is actually available. Epictetus understood the inner citadel not as a philosophical abstraction, but as a daily survival practice. In the Discourses, Book 1, Chapter 1, he described the freedom he had found not despite his slavery but inside it, by understanding with absolute precision what his master could and could not reach. The master could reach his body, could control his location, his labor, his physical circumstances, could break his leg, as the historical record suggests he did. What the master could not reach was the faculty of choice, the proheresis, the part of Epictetus that decided what his circumstances meant, how he would respond to them, what values he would maintain in the middle of conditions designed to strip him of dignity. That part was never enslaved, because it cannot be. The practical application of the inner citadel is not passive. It is not the resignation of a person who has given up on influencing the world. It is the active, disciplined work of maintaining the integrity of your inner life, while the outer life does what outer lives do, which is to say, precisely what they want, according to their own logic, without consulting your preferences. When the diagnosis arrives, when the relationship ends, when the work you built is taken from you or collapses on its own, when the person you counted on turns out to be someone different than who you believed they were. In all of these moments, the question the inner citadel asks is not, why is this happening to me? That question is unanswerable and wastes the only resource available. The question is, what do I do with this, from inside the freedom that nothing outside me can touch? That question is always answerable, not easily, not without cost, but always. Memento Mori, remembering to live. There's a practice so ancient that its origins dissolve into the earliest layers of recorded human thought, so counterintuitive that the modern mind recoils from it on first contact, and so consistently endorsed by every serious philosophical tradition that its near total absence from contemporary culture represents one of the most significant impoverishments of modern life. The practice is the deliberate, regular contemplation of your own death, not in the morbid sense, in the precise opposite sense, in the sense that the Stoics meant when they used the Latin phrase that has come down to us across 20 centuries, memento mori. Remember that you will die. Remember it now. Remember it clearly, specifically, without the soft focus of abstraction that allows the mind to treat mortality as something that applies to people in general, rather than to you, in particular, on a specific day that is approaching whether you turn toward it or away from it. The Stoics were not alone in this practice. The Buddhists developed elaborate meditations on impermanence that serve the same function. The medieval Christian tradition produced the entire genre of ars moriendi, the art of dying. Montaigne wrote that to philosophize is to learn to die, and meant it not as grim instruction but as the most practical advice he could offer, because the person who has genuinely reckoned with the fact of their mortality is a different kind of person than the person who has not. They make different choices. They spend their time differently. They are, in a specific and measurable sense, more alive. This is the paradox at the center of Memento Mori. The regular contemplation of death does not make life feel smaller. It makes it feel larger. It does not increase the experience of loss. It increases the experience of presence. It does not generate despair about the brevity of existence. It generates a quality of attention to what is actually here that ordinary life, with its assumption of unlimited future time, almost never produces. Seneca understood this better than almost anyone who has written about it. He had survived exile, illness, and the court of Caligula. He was, at the time of his letters to Lucilius, an old man who knew that his time was genuinely short, and what he wrote from that position was not what people expect. He wrote about the richness of the present, about the extraordinary quality of attention that becomes available when you stop treating time as infinite, about the difference between a life lived in perpetual deferral, I will fully engage when the conditions improve, when the work is finished, and a life lived in the understanding that waiting for a future moment of complete readiness is simply another name for not living. In letter 1, the very first letter, Seneca opened with a demand. "Reclaim yourself," he wrote. "Gather and save the time that until now has been taken from you, stolen from you, or simply slipped away. The most disgraceful loss is the one due to carelessness." Marcus Aurelius practiced Memento Mori in the Meditations with a specificity that goes beyond general philosophical instruction. In Book 6, paragraph 2, he wrote about looking at the people around him and imagining their deaths, not to be morbid but to be present. The man who irritates you, he will die. The woman whose approval you are seeking, she will die. You, watching all of this, you will die. What did this contemplation produce? Not distance, not cold detachment. The opposite. It produced a quality of tenderness toward the people around him that pure philosophical reflection on duty never quite generates. The contemplation of shared mortality is one of the most powerful producers of genuine compassion available to a human being. It equalizes. It removes the hierarchies of status and achievement that ordinarily organize human perception and replaces them with the single leveling, clarifying fact. We are all in this together, and none of us is getting out. Memento Mori. Remember that you will die. Remember it now, so that now is not wasted. Remember it clearly, so that what is here is actually seen, not as a shadow over life, but as the sharpest possible illumination of it. The view from above. There is a meditation that appears across the Stoic tradition in different forms but always with the same essential structure and purpose. Marcus Aurelius practiced it. Seneca described it. The 20th century philosopher Pierre Hadot named it and analyzed it with more precision than anyone before him. It is called the view from above. You imagine yourself rising, not in any mystical sense, in the sense of a thought experiment that takes your point of view out of the position it almost always occupies, inside your own life, looking at your circumstances as though they were the entire world, and places it somewhere higher. Somewhere from which the relationship between your specific situation and the vast, indifferent, extraordinarily beautiful whole of things becomes visible in a way that ordinary life almost never allows. Begin with your immediate location. The room you are in, the building around it, the street outside. Then further, the city, the region, the country. Then further still, the continent, the globe. The specific angle at which the light of a star 8 minutes away illuminates a spinning planet in the dark. Then the solar system, the galaxy, the observable universe, 93 billion light-years across, populated with more galaxies than there are grains of sand on every beach on Earth. Now return, slowly, back through the scale of things, back to the room, back to the specific situation that, before you left, felt like the whole of reality. What has changed? The situation is identical in every factual respect. The difficulty is still present. The loss is still real. Nothing about the external configuration of your circumstances has been altered by the thought experiment, and yet something has shifted. The shift is in proportion. In the suddenly available recognition that the thing which felt like the entire world from inside it is, from sufficient distance, a small event in an unimaginably large process. A process that was underway long before you arrived and will continue long after you depart. This recognition does not diminish the situation. It contextualizes it. And context is not the enemy of seriousness. It is the condition that makes seriousness possible without collapse. Marcus described this in the Meditations, Book 9, paragraph 30. Look at the things of the world, he wrote, and see how short-lived they are. The universe is transformation, and life is opinion. He was not counseling nihilism. He was counseling perspective. The practical consequence is immediate. The person who has genuinely accessed the view from above carries the proportion with them. When the next urgency arrives, and in a human life urgencies arrive constantly, each one announcing itself as the most important thing currently happening, they have an additional resource available. The capacity to ask, before being entirely consumed, how large is this actually? Sometimes the honest answer is, very large. Some things are genuinely important, genuinely consequential, genuinely deserving of the full weight of attention and will. The view from above does not flatten everything into equal insignificance. It provides the proportion that allows genuine significance to be distinguished from the performed significance that the unexamined mind assigns to almost everything that happens to it. And sometimes the honest answer is, not as large as it felt from inside it, not as permanent, not as defining. And that answer, arrived at honestly through genuine practice, releases something. Not the concern, you can still care. Not the effort, you can still work. But the white-knuckled conviction that this specific situation is the thing on which everything depends. There is almost always recovery. There is almost always a way through that is not visible from inside the urgency, but becomes visible the moment you rise above it even briefly. Your suffering is real, and the universe is very large. Both of these things are true. Holding them together does not diminish the suffering. It places it, and a suffering that has been placed, given its actual size rather than the infinite size that an unexamined mind assigns to what hurts, is a suffering that can be met, worked with, moved through, not because it is small, but because you are not only inside it. Come back and live accordingly. Sympathy of the whole. There is a word the Stoics use that has no precise equivalent in modern English, and the absence of that equivalent is itself a kind of cultural diagnosis. The word is sympathia. It is the root from which the English word sympathy descends, but the meaning has drifted so far that the modern word barely touches what the Stoics intended. In its original philosophical usage, sympathia did not mean the feeling of sorrow for another person's misfortune. It meant something structural, something about the nature of reality itself. It meant the interconnection of all things, the literal, physical, metaphysical fact that everything in existence is continuous with everything else, that nothing is truly separate, that the boundaries we draw between self and world, between individual and community, between human and natural, are useful for navigation but false at the level of what actually is. Marcus Aurelius returned to this idea repeatedly in the Meditations, with an insistence that suggests it was not merely a philosophical position, but a practice he needed, something he had to remind himself of regularly, because ordinary life made it easy to forget. In Book 4, paragraph 3, he wrote, "Constantly regard the universe as one living being, having one substance and one soul. One living being, not a collection of separate things that happen to share a location. A single organism, differentiated in its parts but unified in its nature. The practical consequence of this cosmology, the consequence that mattered to the Stoics not as theory but as lived orientation, is that you are not a visitor to the world. You are not separate from it, observing it from a distance. You are made of it. Your reason is its reason, locally instantiated. Your life is its life, temporarily individuated. And your death is not a departure from the whole, but a return to it. The wave that formed on the surface of the ocean, and is not lost when it loses its individual shape, but simply rejoins the water it was always made of. Epictetus approached Sympathy not through cosmology, but through ethics. In the Discourses, Book 2, Chapter 10, he asked his students to consider what they were, not in the physical sense, but in the relational sense. You are a son, a parent, a citizen, a neighbor, a human being. Each identity carries obligations that are not imposed from outside but emerge from the nature of what the relationship actually is. He extended this outward, beyond family, beyond community, beyond the city, to the species. The Stoics developed the concept of cosmopolitanism, that the primary identity of a human being is not their local identity, but their membership in the community of all human beings. And Epictetus used it not as an abstract political ideal, but as a practical guide to action. Marcus operationalized this in Book 6, Paragraph 7, with a formulation as demanding as anything in the entire tradition. The noblest form of justice, he wrote, is to love even those who wrong you, not to pretend the wrong did not happen, not to deny the reality of injury, but to maintain, even through the experience of being wronged, the recognition that the person who wronged you is also struggling with the same human difficulty, also doing what they judge to be best with the capacity for judgment they have developed under the conditions they have lived through. This is sympathy in the Stoic sense, not the feeling of sorrow at another's pain, though that too. The structural recognition that the other person's inner life is as real as your own. Marcus wrote in Book 8, Paragraph 7, that what injures the hive injures the bee, not as moral instruction, but as a description of structure. The bee and the hive are not separate things with separate interests. The bee is an expression of the hive. What is done to one is done to the other because the other is not separate. Apply this to the human community, to the city, to the species, to the ecosystem. The sympathia is total. Nothing is outside it. Now come back to your specific life, your specific relationships. Bring the total web with you, not as philosophical abstraction, but as felt orientation. The background awareness that what you do here, in this specific interaction with this specific person in this specific moment, enters the web. It moves. It returns. That quality of engagement, that presence to another person that comes from recognizing them as genuinely continuous with you, is what the Stoics meant by virtue in relationship. Not the performance of kindness, the actual recognition, carried in the body and not only in the mind, that the boundary between self and other is, at the level of the logos, effectively transparent. You have never been alone in the way that isolation feels like. The whole has always been available to you because you have always been the whole, looking at itself through one particular pair of eyes. See through those eyes as clearly as you can. The discipline of action, serving the whole. There is a question that every previous chapter has been, in different ways, circling. Given everything the Stoic tradition has taught about acceptance, about releasing what is not in your control, about finding peace in the inner life regardless of external circumstances, given all of that, what are you supposed to actually do? The question is not naive. It is the most important question in the entire tradition, because a philosophy that produces only inner peace, that trains the mind to be undisturbed by the world while the world proceeds without any input from the philosopher, is not a philosophy of life. It is a philosophy of withdrawal. And the Stoics, whatever else they were emphatically not philosophers of withdrawal. Marcus Aurelius ran an empire. Seneca served in government for decades at the most treacherous levels. Epictetus taught students who went on to participate fully in civic life. The philosophy was not despite their engagement, it was because of it. This is the discipline of action, which Pierre Hadot identified as the third of the three Stoic disciplines, and the one that completes the other two. The discipline of desire teaches you to want the right things. The discipline of assent teaches you to judge clearly. The discipline of action teaches you to engage with the world fully, generously, without attachment to outcome, in service of something larger than your individual benefit. The Stoic term for this mode of action is kathekon, appropriate action or duty. It means the action that corresponds to what you actually are, a social being, embedded in relationships and communities and institutions, whose nature is not fulfilled by private virtue alone but requires expression in the world through engagement with others. Epictetus was blunt about this in the Discourses, Book 2, Chapter 10. A person who retreats into philosophical contemplation while neglecting their responsibilities to their community is not practicing Stoicism. They are failing the most important test the philosophy presents, because the logos that runs through you also runs through your community, your city, your species. To refuse to serve it there, to keep your virtue private while the world outside suffers from the absence of people who have developed the capacity to help, is a form of hoarding, dressed in the language of enlightenment. Marcus understood this with a depth that comes through most clearly in the moments when he was most tired. In Book 5, Paragraph 1, he described the experience of waking in the morning reluctant to face the day, a feeling that anyone who has held significant responsibility will recognize immediately. He reminded himself that he was made for work, not for the experience of comfort, for the expression of his capacity in the world. But the Stoic mode of service is not the same as the ordinary mode. The ordinary mode carries, usually invisibly, an attachment to outcome. You serve, and you need the service to be recognized. You contribute, and you need the contribution to matter in a visible way. You work toward goals, and you need the goals to be achieved in the specific form you imagined. The need is understandable. It is also, from the Stoic perspective, a form of corruption, because outcomes are not in your control. Recognition is not in your control. Whether your contribution matters in the way you intended it to matter is not in your control. What is in your control is the quality of the action itself. Seneca wrote in Letter 71 with a precision that cuts through the modern confusion between effort and outcome. The virtuous action is virtuous in the doing of it, regardless of what follows. The action was not for the outcome. The action was for the expression of what you are, your capacity, your judgment, your care, your engagement with the world as a rational social being whose logos requires expression to be fully itself. The archer metaphor, which appears in multiple Stoic texts, captures this with unusual precision. The archer controls the preparation, the selection of the arrow, the assessment of the wind, the quality of the release. The archer does not control what happens after. The wind may shift, the target may move. The archer who has made a perfect release and missed because of a gust has not failed. They have completed what was within their jurisdiction. Act like the archer. Prepare with full seriousness, release with full commitment, and then open your hands. The opening of the hands is not indifference. It is the posture of someone who has given everything they had to give and now trusts, not naively, but on the basis of genuine philosophical understanding, that the whole is working according to a logic larger than any individual's intentions, and that participation in that logic, at full capacity, is what a human life is for. This is the life all previous chapters have been preparing for, not the life of the person who has found peace by withdrawing from difficulty, but the life of the person who has developed the capacity to engage with difficulty at full strength, to bring the whole of what they are into contact with the whole of what the world is, without the corrosion of attachment to outcome that makes most human effort eventually exhausting and eventually bitter. The practice that never ends. There is a temptation, at the end of any serious philosophical inquiry, to reach for a conclusion that feels like an arrival. A place where the work is done, the understanding is complete, and the wisdom that has been gathered can be set down like luggage at the end of a long journey and rested against while the hard part recedes into the past. The Stoics would not give you that conclusion, not because they were withholding, because it does not exist. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the world, a man who had studied philosophy since youth, who had practiced these disciplines for decades, was still arguing with himself in his private notebooks about getting out of bed. still reminding himself not to be swept away by the opinions of people who would be dead and forgotten within a generation, still writing notes about things he had apparently forgotten since the last time he wrote notes about them. The Meditations is not a document of philosophical achievement. It is a document of philosophical practice, of a person working the disciplines rather than having completed them. And that is not a failure of Marcus Aurelius. It is the most important truth the Meditations contains. The Stoic life is not a destination. It is a direction. It is not a state you achieve and then maintain without effort. It is a practice you return to. Every day in every situation, with whatever clarity and whatever proportion and whatever quality of will you have managed to develop since the last time you returned to it. What changes with practice is not the elimination of the struggle. The fantasia does not stop arriving. The impulse to cross the line does not disappear. The temptation to live inside the gap between what is and what you wanted does not cease to exist. The urgency that looks more significant from inside it than it actually is does not announce itself as distortion. What changes is the speed of recovery, the distance between falling and returning, the time between the moment you lose the proportion and the moment you find it again. That distance, which in the beginning of practice might be weeks, becomes days, then hours, then, in the moments when the practice is deepest, something almost imperceptible. A brief disorientation followed by a recognition followed by a return. That return is the practice, not the state that precedes the falling. The falling is human and inevitable. The return is Stoic. The return is the work. Epictetus closed the Enchiridion, his practical handbook for Stoic living, not with a promise of freedom from difficulty, but with a demand for consistency. He described the philosopher not as someone who has transcended the ordinary conditions of human life, but as someone who has developed the habit of meeting those conditions with the full force of their prepared will. The preparation never ends because the conditions never stop arriving. The practice never concludes because the life it is embedded in never stops producing new material. This is not discouraging. Or rather, it is only discouraging if you came here looking for a shortcut. If what you wanted was a technique that, once mastered, would eliminate the difficulty of being alive. The Stoics do not offer that. Neither does anyone who is telling you the truth. What the Stoics offer is something harder and more valuable. They offer a framework for engaging with the difficulty as it actually is, not as it should be, not as it will be when you have finally sorted out the last obstacle, but as it is right now, in this situation, with this much clarity and this much will and this much equanimity available to you today. That engagement, practiced daily in the small, unremarkable moments of ordinary life as much as in the dramatic ones, is what produces the quality that all of the previous chapters have been describing. Not as a permanent possession, but as a recurring achievement. Not as a trophy displayed on a shelf, but as a capacity exercised in the field, under conditions when it matters. Seneca wrote in Letter 77 that the point is not how long you live, but how you live in the time you have. He was not making a point about death. He was making a point about presence, about the difference between a life spent in perpetual preparation for a moment of real engagement that never quite arrives, and a life spent actually engaged right now with what is actually here. What is actually here is your life, not the improved version. Not the post-obstacle version. Not the version in which the people around you have finally behaved the way you needed them to behave, and the circumstances have finally arranged themselves the way you needed them to arrange themselves. This version, the one that is happening right now, with its specific difficulties and its specific gifts and its specific set of challenges that are, if you receive them with the orientation the Stoics practiced, precisely the material your capacity requires to become what it needs to become. Begin the practice today, not when you feel ready. Readiness is one of the mind's most elegant deferral strategies. Begin with the question Epictetus placed at the beginning of everything. Is this in my control or not? Begin with the pause, the anoksh, between stimulus and response. Begin with the view from above, however briefly, however imperfectly. Begin with the recognition that the weight you are carrying contains, somewhere inside it, The line between what is yours and what belongs to a jurisdiction larger than yours. You will lose the line. You will pick the weight back up. You will find yourself at 2 a.m. rehearsing scenarios in the wrong direction, managing outcomes that were never yours to manage, carrying the accumulated deliveries you never agreed to accept. And then you will remember, and remembering you will return. And the return is the practice. The return is the philosophy. The return is, if you stay with it long enough, in enough different situations, through enough different kinds of difficulty, the life. Not a life without weight. A life in which you know with increasing precision and increasing speed exactly which weight is yours to carry, and what to do with everything else.